Older home movies captured on tape or DVDs are special snapshots of our past, but they usually look pretty bad when played on modern 4K TVs or shared over social media networks. Luckily, there's now an easy way to convert those older files to 4K using the best methods available with completely free Windows software. As long as your original tapes or files were transferred over properly, it doesn't matter if your home movie started out as VHS, DVD, or anything else. This guide will work for you. So, let's take a look. Some quick disclaimers before we begin, and by far the most important disclaimer: if your home video started out as VHS, Super 8, or any kind of analog tape media, they have to be digitized properly for this to work right. I recently showed how to get high-quality 480i transfers using RetroRGB products, and I'll have a few more videos coming up that show other capture cards and even the Doomsday Project. Basically, if your tapes were digitized correctly using any of those methods, this guide will work fine. But the sad fact is, almost every YouTube video or blog tutorial shows wrong ways to digitize your tapes. I'll show you how to verify your files before you begin to make sure they were transferred properly. And that's the next disclaimer. Verifying your files can be a bit tricky, but it's required in order to get this process right. I'll go back and do a recap at the end to show how easy this actually is once you get the hang of it, but please stick with me until that point so you'll understand why you can't just drop a file into BravoCon and start converting. The next disclaimer is to clarify this guide is for interlaced home movies. Depending on the source, 480p or lower files might look okay, but you'll really need to scale a sample clip and see for yourself. Also, I only have access to NTSC equipment. I try my best to mention PAL resolutions and refresh rates, and BravoCon is definitely compatible with PAL. I just don't have any easy ways to demo that for you. And lastly, this video isn't sponsored by anybody, I'm not being paid to make it, and all the software I talk about really is free. That said, if I find an affiliate link for anything that I talk about, I'm going to put it in the description because that and Patreon support is the only way this channel could stay alive. Alright, let's jump in. As stated before, the main prerequisite for getting started are source files that were properly transferred to your PC. Unfortunately, if your file came from analog media like VHS, it's very likely that it was transferred wrong. That said, if your tapes were properly transferred, or if older digital recordings didn't compress the video too much, you'll get some great results. In fact, if your home movies are from older DVD camcorders, you're in luck. Just use free software like VOB to MPG and a PC DVD drive to convert the disc to an MPEG file. It really is as easy as importing a disc and having it spit out MPEG files. Just a warning, if you've already transferred your tapes to DVD, you'll definitely have better results if you recaptured the tapes using proper methods, as the 420 MPEG compression applied by DVD recording will lower the quality of your VHS, Super 8, and other tapes. It might not be a huge difference, but it's definitely not as good as a proper transfer. Honestly though, using DVD recorders isn't nearly as bad as most other solutions, so if that's your only option, or if you don't have the original tapes anymore, all of this should still work fine. Especially if you have a DVD recorder with time-based correction built in. Then it'll be better than basically every standalone solution you could find on Amazon today. As for software, you'll just need VirtualDub 2 and BravoCon, or Broadcast Quality Video Converter. Both are GUI front ends for excellent command line based tools that really simplify the process. Both are free and don't even need installing. Just download them and extract them to your computer. I'll just put them on my desktop for this video. Then, download and install the Lagarith codec and AVI synth. I don't think the order matters, just make sure they're both installed before you start any of this process. I'd reboot when you're done, even though it's probably not necessary. I think rebooting might be more helpful from a system resources point of view, as when your PC comes back up, you'll have less programs running, but either way, I'd just do it. Okay, let's move on to testing your file. This guide is focused on older home movies, which should have been digitized in their original interlaced resolution. You could still scale progressive scan files, but have realistic expectations. 480p home movies will probably look good with this method, but 720p and 1080p files might not need scaling at all, as modern displays usually do a good job with those. Also, even if you think your file is interlaced, you need to run some quick tests before scaling to determine it's actually interlaced. It's a bit of a learning curve at first, but I promise once you do it a few times, you'll get the hang of it. Start by right-clicking the file you're looking to scale, hitting Properties, and selecting the Details tab. You might have to scroll down a bit, but look for frame width, height, and rate. A quick side note, if for whatever reason this information is missing from Windows Properties, you can install a free program called Media Info. Then just right-click on the file, hit Load More Options if you're on Windows 11, and select Media Info. Then go to View and select Tree, then scroll down to Video. Media Info is really handy, but just using Windows File Properties should be all you need, so if you see the information you're looking for, there's no need for Media Info, just use Windows Properties. Anyway, after selecting the Details tab, check out the frame height. If it's 480 or 576, then continue. If it's anything higher, it's probably HD, and once again, you probably don't need to scale it. As a note, if the resolution is 1920 by 1080, it might be 1080i. You could follow the rest of this guide to verify if it's interlaced and try using Bravocon, but I've run into a ton of issues with how 1080i files are saved and interpreted by software. There's no harm in trying, but I'd need an entirely separate video to explain 1080i, so I won't be covering it here. Let me know in the comments if 1080i worked for you. Okay, now verify the frame rate. If it's listed as 50 or higher, you'll want to stop for a moment. If your file came from analog tape media, it's very likely they were already deinterlaced and scaled wrong. It's up to you if you want to continue, but recapturing your tapes the right way will have much better results. On the flip side, if the file came from an older digital recorder, it might actually be native 480 progressive scan, and it's worth running a test scale to see how it looks. Maybe it'll be great, or maybe not. At this point, if the frame rate of your file is over 30, you could skip to the next section and just treat it as if it were progressive scan in Bravocon. However, I really hope you'll stick with me to see why this stuff matters. And don't worry, we'll do a full recap at the end and skim through all of this quickly without all the explanation between. So, if the file properties show 30 frames or under, let's verify for sure that it's interlaced and what the field order is. Open VirtualDub and drag your file in. First, simply hit play to verify the file is working. Next, make sure your preview window is set up properly. Go to View and make sure both input and output panes are checked off. Then, under Pane Layout, I'd select both panes, Auto Size panes, and Pan and Zoom Center. I usually like to make the input panes smaller than the output, but I'll keep them even in this video just to make these examples easier to see. You can reset them at any time just by hitting Auto Size again. Now go to Video Filters. Hit the Add button and select Deinterlace. Leave the default setting of interpolate using Yadif algorithm, then select Double Frame Rate Top Field First, or TFF. Now click the Frame Forward button and move through a portion of the video with motion, one frame at a time. See how on the left there's horizontal combing lines on the screen and the video only moves every other frame, and how on the right it moves with each frame? The left panel is demonstrating that this file has both interlaced fields properly weaved together into every frame, and the panel on the right is showing each field deinterlaced to its own frame. If having multiple fields per frame sounds confusing to you, it's because it is. It makes no sense when you're talking in the context of modern displays. However, you have to remember this technology was all invented when CRTs were the only way that people could watch video at home. And the multiple field technique was actually a pretty ingenious way to get more detail on screen, even though a CRT, or at least a consumer-grade CRT of the time, could only refresh at 15 kilohertz a second, which would have a very fixed vertical resolution. So CRTs would start this process by drawing a beam of light from left to right, from top to bottom. However, in order to get the illusion of more detail, it would start by drawing only the even fields of a video, then go back to the top and draw the odd fields. In the context of TV and movies, each field was actually half of the information for a single frame, and our eye's persistence of vision would blend those two fields together to have one very detailed frame containing all of the information. Almost all home movies, as well as other content like sports broadcasts, soap operas, newscasts, and stuff like that, treated each field as its own discrete frame with its own information in it. And this allowed for a 60 frame per second in the US frame rate, which allowed for smoother motion because there were more frames per second. A good way to visualize this is something called Bob deinterlacing, which is a very fast and easy way to take each field, separate it to its own frame, but leave all the content exactly as is. Your persistence of vision on a modern display will still be able to see the entire image, however you get a bobbing effect, which does cause a flicker as you see the frames and fields rotate between each. In order to properly display interlaced video on modern displays, each field needs to be separated into its own frame, but then an algorithm needs to go back and inspect the field before and after in order to recreate the information in the missing fields. The QT-GMC deinterlacing Bravicon uses gives you the most accurate result to a CRT without any flicker, and its combination of Lanczos 4 and NETI 3 scaling brings it up to a modern resolution really nicely. As a note, quite a few people in the broadcast world have commented on some of my other videos telling me that 720 by 480 at 2997 isn't actually interlaced video, but this is all just a matter of terminology. See, both SMPTE and EBU standards refer to it as either 480i60 or even 480 at 5994i, but all three are describing the exact same thing. If you see video with I at the end, it's usually talking about how many fields per second. So if you see 60i, it would be 60 interlaced fields per second. However, when you see something like 2997, it could mean that it's about 30 frames per second of progressive scan video, but it could also mean that there are 2 fields per 30 frames, essentially making it 60 fields per second. I did a podcast with a friend of mine who works in the broadcast world, but also does a lot of work with video games too. As a result, he did a great job bridging the gap between the language both industries use, explaining in ways both groups can understand. If you'd like more info, definitely check that out. Anyway, while that previous demo seemed right, let's go back and change the deinterlace filter to bottom field first, or BFF, and see how that looks. See how the video jumps around? That's because the fields are now out of order. So that confirmed 2 things. The file is definitely interlaced, and it's recorded as top field first, or TFF. To be clear, it doesn't matter if the file is TFF or BFF as long as you know which one it is. Just mark down which of the settings was correct. So that's an example of a file that's 2997 that we proved is definitely interlaced. But now let's check out the opposite scenario, a file that looks like it could be interlaced, but isn't. Some of these files are listed with 2997 frame rates, while others show 30, or even weird ones like 2967. So just by the specs, these files could be interlaced, or they could just be about 30 frames per second of progressive scan video. I'll start by closing VDub to clear all the filters, and yes, I know you could just delete the deinterlacing filter, but closing the program is faster and less prone to missing something else, so just trust me. Now I'll reopen VDub, drag in one of the other files, and advance 1 frame at a time. There's no interlacing combing artifacts, and each frame seems like it's advancing fine, but let's add the same deinterlacing filter as last time to see what happens. As we advance frame by frame, both panes show the exact same thing, and you have to advance 2 frames for movement on screen. That means instead of separating fields, it just doubled each frame. If that's the case with your file, you need to stop and ask where it came from. As I mentioned before, if these files came from some kind of digital recorder, that's totally fine. It would just mean it was recorded in 480p 30. However, if these files came from analog tapes, they were digitized wrong, and you'll need to stop for a moment and try to figure out why. First, did you use some generic box to digitize your tapes? If so, they probably did a bad job deinterlacing the file and may have even dropped half the frames. If you'd like more details about what I'm showing, I went over this in the RetroTink 480i video, but to quickly summarize, some capture solutions delete half the information in the signal. You can still scale them and treat them as progressive scan in Bravicon, but you'll lose half the frame rate as well as detail. If you want to try scaling a file that was improperly digitized, just have realistic expectations. The audio and video will probably drift out of sync, and the video might even be a bit shaky. To be clear, that's not the result of this process. That's some of the many bad things that happen when tapes are improperly digitized. Seriously consider retransferring them the right way if these videos matter at all to you. Okay, so the hard part is over and the rest of this guide is much easier. Let's move on to trimming, as that's always a really handy thing to learn. Now I want to show you how to trim your files, as this is going to end up saving you a lot of time. First, we're going to create a test trim, which will allow you to run through the rest of this process very quickly to verify that everything's working. But also, you'll want to learn how to trim just the portions of the files that you want scaled, because that'll save you a ton of time in the long run as well. You could also use this opportunity to re-encode your files if you need to. And heck, even if you want one file that's a scale of an entire tape you captured, it's still best to at least trim off any empty space at the beginning and end, like you'd find on almost all home video tapes. Start by opening VDub and dragging your file in. If VDub's already open, close it and reopen it just to clear any previous settings like I showed before. And look, I know it seems weird, but just close it and reopen it. I can't tell you how much time I've wasted trying to track down a problem that didn't exist simply because I'd left a previous setting or filter on. So just closing VDub and reopening it, make sure that that won't happen to you. Now use the slider on the bottom to scroll through the video. We'll need a test clip to verify the next scaling step, and for that, it's best to trim a clip with motion on the screen and some detail. After you find your spot, hit the Mark In button at the beginning. Then move the slider over a few seconds and hit Mark Out. You'll only need about a 10-second clip. Now go to Video and hit Direct Stream Copy. This tells VDub to match the exact codec and color space of the original file with zero conversion at all. Then go to File, Save Video. Make sure to select QuickTime.mov from the drop-down menu for compatibility, then name it whatever you'd like. Then hit Save. If the original codec is compatible with VDub, the trimmed clip will save really fast since there's no re-encoding. If the file is incompatible, you'll just get an error message. If that's the case, no big deal. Go back to Video and select Full Processing Mode. Then go to Video and Compression to select your preferred codec. A lot of people archiving video prefer FFV1, and if you know what you're doing, feel free to try it, but I personally use Lagarith for compatibility reasons. Just click on that, and then click on Pixel Format. I suggest starting by selecting No Change. However, if your source file's color space isn't compatible with Bravicon, you could always change it to YUV here. More on that later. Then go to File, Save Video, and once again make sure to select QuickTime.move from the drop-down menu. Just name it whatever you'd like, and hit Save. Now go to File, Close Video File, then drag the new test clip you just exported back into VDub. No need to close and reopen this time because we didn't add any filters. Move forward one frame at a time and make sure nothing got messed up. I've often forgotten to close and reopen VDub at the beginning of this process, and here's where I'll see that issue manifest. The trimmed clip would be messed up, but the original file would still be fine. If your file is progressive scan and it looks just like the original, you're good to go. If your source files are interlaced, run the same test procedure I showed in the previous section by adding the deinterlacing filter. If the field order still matches and everything advances smoothly, you're all set. Just close VDub and proceed. So now you have the ability to trim off a short clip in order to run through the scaling process without wasting time scaling the entire thing in case something goes wrong. But also, if your home movies are anything like mine, there is a ton of filler with only a few clips here and there that you would actually want to take the time to scale and share. So now you could just save yourself a ton of time and only clip off the parts that you really want. Now, finally, here's how to scale your files using Bravicon. Sorry it took so long to get here, but if you missed any of the previous steps, what comes next would really just be a waste of your time. Anyway, start by opening Bravicon and selecting your input file. Then set your target file. I'll just name it the same thing, but with 4K in front of it. The default container should be .mov, but just double check that's the case, as that'll be a lot more compatible for other software than .avis. Now check either interlaced or progressive based on what you learned about your source file. This test clip is interlaced and TFF, so I'll select those options. Noise reduction's up to you. I'll show examples later, but I normally prefer to just leave this off. Next are the resize options, and you'll need to choose based on what your source file is. Verifying is as easy as playing the file. You should be able to tell right away if it's wide or not simply by playing it. Some DVD camcorders had a widescreen option, so this is definitely something you'd run into. So if the file is 720 by 480 and you know for sure your source is widescreen, select 16 by 9. If it's not widescreen, select 4 by 3 from the drop-down box. Select this regardless of the horizontal resolution, 720, 704, 640. If it's a 4 by 3 source, Bravicon will automatically apply the correct algorithm to make sure the aspect ratio is exactly what it's supposed to be and what you would have seen on a CRT. And once again, this is all due to how CRTs work. They use TV lines, not pixels. Here's an example. Most capture cards save 480i video as 720 pixels wide. When those square pixels are viewed on modern displays, it makes the image look much wider than you'd see on a CRT. Other capture cards save 480i as 640 pixels wide, which as square pixels are slightly more narrow than you'd have seen on a CRT. But none of this matters on an actual CRT. As long as the vertical resolution matches the refresh rate, it just draws whatever the horizontal resolution is within the confines of the 4 by 3 screen. More resolution on the horizontal axis means more detail, but it's always going to be about the same width to height ratio. Bravicon's 4 by 3 setting tries its best to calculate the input resolution and match that to the same 4 by 3 ratio that it was intended to be viewed at. This is actually something the creator Simon is still working on, and at the time this video went public, with Bravicon version 1.2.1, the aspect ratio is a bit too wide for 720 sources. At the very least, it's not stretching to 16 by 9, and you could easily correct this in basically any video editing software if you'd like. Getting these algorithms right is really tricky, so keep an eye on Simon's GitHub to see when the aspect correction has been totally fixed. Anyway, now under Output Settings, select 3840 by 2160 for a 4K output. Then set your frame rate. If your source was interlaced, set it to 5994 or 50p for PAL users. If your source was progressive, just set the frame rate to match whatever the source was, 2997, 30, 60, whatever. Next, select your video codec. If you plan on using the 4K files in video editing software to make further changes, or if you have a ton of space on your hard drive and want less compression, I'd select ProRes and PCM S24LE for audio. The file sizes will be really big though, so I wouldn't use it just for sharing files. Most people will probably want H.264 and AAC for audio, as that's normal compression that results in much smaller file sizes. You could do that by messing with the settings here, or if you're familiar with Handbrake, you could export via ProRes, then use your favorite compression profile in Handbrake. That's totally up to you though, and just using Bravicon's built-in compression should be fine. Now just hit the Convert button and wait for the new file to generate. Some quick troubleshooting. If you pressed Convert and nothing happened, it almost always means you forgot a setting. Just double check everything in Bravicon and try again. It could also mean you forgot to install AVI Synth, so check that too. The other Bravicon issue I've run into is after hitting the Convert button, it immediately says complete but doesn't generate a file. This has always been an issue with how Bravicon interprets the source file. The creator Simon has worked really hard to correct all of those errors, and if you'd like to hear more from him, check out a podcast we did, but there still might be some use cases where files won't be compatible. If that's the case, simply changing the container and color space in the trimming process should fix it. Make sure you're using the .mov container, and if that still doesn't work, you could try changing the color space from RGB to YUY or YUV. I have a guide on RetroRGB showing this process. It should barely add any time to the trimming process, and since you're not adding compression, the resulting files should be identical. After you hit Convert, processing will take a while, even on a fast PC. You'll be happy you started with a short test clip, as if there's any mistakes, you'll save a lot of time rescaling it. When it's done, start by simply playing the file. Does everything look okay, and are the audio and video still in sync? If so, there's one more test. Open VDub again and drop in the newly created file. No need to add any filters, just move forward one frame at a time. If everything looks smooth and the frame on screen changes every time you hit the arrow, you're done. If not, maybe reboot and try again. I know that sounds a bit cliche for a nerd like me to say, but I've had some crazy errors happen that don't really make sense. I could only guess that having multiple GUI front ends that all access the same background software like FFmpeg is what was causing my issues. So if you run into this, start by rebooting your computer, and then after you're done in VDub, make sure to close that program before accessing and opening BravoCon. And if you still have issues, I guess maybe reboot between VDub and BravoCon just to narrow down what the problem is. If you're still having issues, is this a home movie or something else? If you're scaling 480i video game footage, the game might not be generating 60 unique fields per second. You could still scale the file, but you'd get duplicated frames, which is fine as that's exactly how it was output from the game console. Also, if you've captured an old TV show, it might have been converted from its original frame rate to your regional broadcast spec. You could try running inverse telecine, but it might be impossible to fix, as some shows actually had 2 or more conversions applied. If you just run the scaling process as shown in this video, it'll work fine, just in the same frame rate you'd have seen it on TV. That means this is not an archival solution for footage like that, but it may accomplish what you're looking for. That's all out of the scope of this video, but I wanted to mention it in case you ran into home movies that were an odd frame rate. That almost surely won't happen with VHS camcorders, but I'm sure there's some weird scenario out there. And of course, as I've warned you many times in this video, it could just be that there was a problem with how you ripped your source. Just make sure the file is actually interlaced, and if you think it's a field order issue, swap to the opposite one in BravoCon and try again. You can't fix broken source files, though. So now what to do with the leftover files? In my opinion, the original is the most important, so I always archive that one. Since I confirmed the scaled file is working fine, I usually delete the trimmed clip as it's just a copy of the original anyway. It's totally up to you if you'd like to keep the 4K files after sharing them. I like to, but if you don't have the disk space, you could always run this whole process again. Unlike analog media, you could run this process an infinite amount of times and it will never degrade the quality of your source. So it's up to you if you would like to keep the file or just delete it to save hard drive space and rescale again in the future if you ever need to. Alright, so after all that, let's see how that test clip looked. I think considering it's a VHS source, it looks great, but we need some context. First, I want to set your expectations properly. I recorded some footage with a VHS camcorder and also used my 4K60 Lumix GH5 to shoot the same scene. I did this both to be ridiculous, but also to prove that no scaling and deinterlacing method will ever magically turn 480i into 4K video. That said, I think if you consider the source, this method did an excellent job deinterlacing and scaling to 4K. I also want to show you why any of this is necessary at all. I took that raw 480i test clip and uploaded it directly to YouTube. Here's how just watching a 480i file via YouTube's processing compares to this workflow. This is the perfect example of why you shouldn't just share 480i files. They need to have some processing done or they'll look terrible. That's even true for video editing software. Here's the 480i test clip scaled and deinterlaced to 4K via Adobe Premiere. The file was just dropped into an existing 4K60 timeline, and the automatic deinterlacing is filled with ugly combing artifacts. And look, I know you can right-click, modify, and interpret footage to set the field order and aspect ratio, but I'm always afraid I'll forget a setting. Prescaling with BravoCon seems to look a bit better for home movies, but it also allows you to verify the conversion before you import it into your timeline, so you'll know exactly what the rendered file will look like. Plus, you could just drag it into your timeline without messing with any settings. Okay, now let's compare a file that was properly captured as 480i to some other capture solutions. I've tested a few standalone recorders and they're absolute trash. This one couldn't even keep the audio and video in sync for only 30 seconds, and the results were just terrible. No scaling software on the planet can fix this. This box kept the audio and video in sync, but it stretched the scaled output to 1080p, which the company advertised as a customer-requested feature, by the way. Ugh. The 640 by 480 output is pretty ugly too, but it gets worse. It actually deletes the second field, dropping your frame rate in half. So it doesn't even record in 480i, but a half resolution, half frame rate 480p. This is the perfect example of what I've been warning you about this whole video. If your tapes aren't transferred using proper methods, there's no fixing the source file. Moving on, here's how Bravicon works with DVD camcorders. I made sure to set the camera to its highest recording settings too, so that extra compression wouldn't be applied. The deinterlacing looks great, but MPEG compression really hasn't aged well. There's pixelation and a bunch of artifacts on both. Funny that a format as lossy as VHS can occasionally scale better for home movies than digital, but these DVD camcorders at least use less compression than some digital cameras of the era. Speaking of which, here's digital 480p video from a pretty nice late 2000s digital camera. The image is sharper, but you can see more of the compression artifacts than on the lower quality YouTube upload. This definitely proves that you should keep realistic expectations when scaling older digital content, but pre-scaling might still be worth your time. Oddly enough, some 240p video from older digital cameras isn't too bad. At the very least, it's better than uploading directly to a social media service. As always, just trim a clip and give it a try. Maybe it's worth scaling, maybe not, but it was certainly worth trying just for this clip. Also, you might be wondering why we're using Bravicon at all when VDub has YADIF deinterlacing built right in, which I suggested to use for field order testing. While YADIF is really fast and perfect for testing, as you can see here, it just doesn't compare to the deinterlacing and scaling Bravicon uses. So, an excellent tool, but testing and cutting with VDub and scaling with Bravicon is definitely a step up. Now let's compare it to the RetroTinks. The Bravicon scaled footage you've been seeing this whole time was actually captured via a RetroTinks 480i pass-through mode, and it did an excellent job. The RetroTink 5X and 4K's biggest advantage for transferring tapes, though, is you could simply capture the output in HD. That means no worrying about field order or anything like that. As long as you use the proper profiles, everything will just work. While the Tinks are the best scalers and deinterlacers available for video games, you can see that the slower, software-based Bravicon is an improvement. But it's up to you if all the extra time and effort I've been showing in this video is worth it. I imagine sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. One of the main reasons you might want to archive your videos in their original format is to see how future software can improve the deinterlacing and scaling. Here's Topaz AI both deinterlacing and scaling to 4K. Topaz got the aspect ratio wrong, and there's some weird over-sharpening. I wanted to remove deinterlacing from the equation, so I used Bravicon to deinterlace to 480p, then let Topaz AI scale that 480p file to 4K. Some parts are better, others are worse. I think it'll be a while before AI can filter out VHS tape noise, but I'm looking forward to seeing how this technology evolves. Using AI for digital files gives some interesting results. It was okay for the DVD recording, but I think overall Bravicon did a better job, at least for now. I imagine AI scaling will keep improving over time, though. I was really impressed at how AI cleaned up that lossy 480p 30 file. However, the trade-off is a waxy, almost fake look. You'd have to try this on a clip-by-clip basis to see which is better. I think with home video resolutions as low as 240p, there's never going to be a perfect way to scale it, and AI once again did a good job, but with the trade-off of looking fake. I think any pre-scaling seems better than relying on social media to do it, though. A few more quick comparisons before we move on. I also wanted to show the noise reduction option, which is meant for noisy and grainy clips you might find in low-light scenarios or in some older digital cameras. As you can see, it didn't do anything to the brightly lit VHS dog shot, but it really cleaned up the 480p video from that digital camera. That's why it's really important to start with that short test clip and experiment. Some videos might look better with noise reduction on, so you've just got to try it yourself and see. I also wanted to show using a DVD recorder. Here's that Samsung combo unit I showed before. This thing has a built-in time-based corrector, and transferring tapes is as easy as pressing this one button, then hitting stop when you're done recording, then just finalizing the disc. If we zoom in, we can see a bit of that 420 compression I talked about before. Honestly though, while yes, you should be saving anything that's really important to you in the best quality possible, I'd take a nice DVD combo unit any day over some of those terrible standalone boxes I showed before. If you run the disc through the process I showed here, it won't be that bad at all. Also, a lot of people ask me what the component video output of a player like this would look like when set to the tape's original resolution of 480i. The hope is it would essentially be like using a high-end VCR's S-video output without any scaling or deinterlacing applied, and it was close. It's dimmer, and if you look at the grass, you'll see some weirdness. I'd definitely rather use a high-end SVHS deck for tape transfer, but if this is all you have access to, I'd use it any day over one of those crappy standalone boxes I showed before. Just don't bother using a player like this as HDMI output or 480p output from it, as that would essentially be the same as one of those terrible composite to HDMI adapters I showed before. Also, I've mentioned 480i video games a few times, so here's some examples. This is really going to come down to the type of game and your preference. Using something like the RetroTink 4K and wobbling pixels profiles can get you a really sharp, retro look. Using Bravicon will have the opposite effect, and it would smooth out the graphics. What you prefer is completely up to you. For me personally, it comes down to the game. Some just look better sharp, while others are better smoothed. I definitely would not recommend Bravicon for 240p stuff, but if you have a 480i only game and the ability to capture in its native format, give it a try and see what happens. Maybe you'll like the results. Now, I could spend hours showing more comparisons, but they'd all be using equipment that's no longer manufactured. There's some DVD-O boxes that do a great job, and you could even find some neat Furuja equipment that does an amazing job deinterlacing to 480p or 720p, then you could scale again after. In fact, dedicated boxes like this are often the easiest way to run inverse telecine like I mentioned before, so any video nerds might want to look into these. Just for fun, someday I'd love to do a video comparing the deinterlacing of a ton of different really high-end older pieces of equipment, and there might even be a better solution out there, but I think for home movies, most people will find the completely free Bravicon to be the best pick for them. Alright, I know that was a lot, but I promise after you get the hang of it, it goes much quicker. So I'm going to run through all of this again in real time, both to prove to you that it really is very easy once you get the hang of it, but also in case you ever need to come back to this video for a refresher course, this way you don't have to rewatch the entire thing. You could just skip to the end and watch how you do it in real time without any of that explanation. I'll use another short video I took of my dog-in-law on an old DVD camcorder. As shown before, the process would be exactly the same for properly transferred tapes though. Okay, let's check the properties. 720 by 480 and 2997. Should be good. Now let's drop it into VDub and check the file. 1, 2, 3. Okay, the audio and video are in sync, so let's check field order. TFF looks fine, but there's this weird black outline around the dog. It's happening in both the source and filter windows, so I bet there was an issue with how the 420 compression of the camera interpreted the shady backyard. Either way, it's part of the source and definitely not an issue with this process, so let's move along. Let's just test BFF to confirm TFF is definitely correct, which it was. This is jumping around now. Now I'll close and reopen VDub to reset the filters. Drag the file back in. Then I'll set the codec to lags and no change. I'll set the input and output points to only save the part of the file I'd actually like to keep in scale. This short clip is almost as short as a test clip, so I'll just use the whole thing. No need to do this twice. Then I'll save the file and just add clip to the name to differentiate it, once again saving it as an MOV. Okay, now I'll close VDub and open Bravicon. Select the input file. I'll name the output file the same thing, just with Brav at the beginning. Check interlaced and leave the field order at TFF, like we determined. Set stretch to 4x3, 3840 by 2160 4K output at 5994. And since I'll be dropping this file into a video editing timeline, I'll pick ProRes. Now I'll just hit convert and wait. After it finishes, I'll check off noise reduction and run it again under a file named NR. I'm really curious to see if it does anything to the black outline we saw before. Okay, now it's time to try the final results. 1, 2, 3. The audio and video are still in sync. And while you could see compression artifacts from the DVD codec, it looks pretty decent. Let's check the noise reduction file though. Nope, it didn't fix the black outline. Oh well, worth the try. So now I'll delete the NR file as well as the trimmed clip. I'll keep the original as an archive and upload the scaled version. Okay, that's it. Not bad at all, right? And don't forget that if you have multiple files from the same source that were all digitized the same way, then you could just test one of them and go ahead and skip right to the scaling part with the rest. I mean, I like to trim my files anyway, and I'm a nerd with OCD, so I'm going to be testing every single file, but the option's there if you want to. So look, I know this video was long, and I'm sure parts of it were probably boring, but respectfully, I'm not sure if a lot of people watching will realize how much harder this stuff used to be without people like Simon creating really easy to use front ends for some of these background processes. Before it, you'd have to write scripts and run everything directly from the command line. And to be clear, the people who make things like AVI Synth and Qt-GMC deinterlacing are geniuses, and we all owe them our thanks. That said, the simple fact is, without GUI-based tools like VirtualDub and Bravocon, most people just wouldn't be able to use them. Also, a big shout out to Fudo, Dan Mons, and Mike Chi for keeping me sane during this entire process. Believe it or not, I've spent well over a year researching and testing to make sure that we get this information out to you in the clearest way possible, and there is no chance I could have done that without them. Anyway, if you liked this video, please consider subscribing to the channel, and there's plenty of ways to support even more, including ones that are completely free. Clicking on the RetroRGB support page and scrolling down will bring you to affiliate links that let you buy stuff from Amazon at the exact same price, but we get a small cut. Just click that link before going to your cart to help us out. If you're not super into this stuff but feel generous, maybe leave a tip directly through PayPal or Ko-fi. Even the smallest tip is appreciated, and links are on that same page. And if you rely on info like this, please consider signing up for monthly support services like Patreon and Floatplane. We recently turned off all ads on RetroRGB.com to make the experience better, but there's no way we could have afforded that without amazing monthly supporters. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.